Hi, everyone. Let's give it one more minute. I see some folks have just entered the waiting room, so we'll just give folks a minute to join. Okay, let's jump in. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining. Thanks so much to ICCR for what's been a really great conference this week. Thanks to John for back-end coordination and everything. And we're the few and the mighty at the end of the day on Friday. So thank you all for joining. It really actually is really meaningful and wonderful to have folks join us for this topic. So the goal of this session is to introduce the topic of religious coexistence in the workplace, provide context for this topic as a piece of diversity, equity, inclusion efforts, share some of what we've learned as an organization as we've advocated on this topic, and to end with an action step, which is inviting everyone on the call to consider signing on to a new investor statement on religious coexistence in the workplace. I'm sorry, John, that I forgot to mention the technical details at the beginning of the call. But I know folks have heard them probably in previous sessions, and we should all be able on this session to unmute ourselves. If you have any trouble, let John know.
Yep, no worries at all. I'm here.
Okay, sorry. It's one of the, yeah, sorry about that. Sorry for forgetting. Okay, so I'll jump in. I'll just introduce our organization to give you some context. Many of you know us already, but some of you might not. So JLens serves as the bridge between the Jewish community and the global responsible impact investing arena. So internal to the Jewish community, we do education, capacity building. We seek to grow the Jewish community's engagement with impact investing and values-based investing. And then externally, we represent the Jewish community, Jewish communal values, Jewish communal issues in the global responsible investing arena with corporations through shareholder advocacy. We run the Jewish advocacy strategy, which is our investment strategy. That's our platform for doing shareholder advocacy. Investors include Jewish institutions across the United States. And we do advocacy on a range of Jewish values that I won't go very deep into right now, but I'll mention that one of the 6 key values pillars that undergirds our work is coexistence and peace building. So this category sort of fits into what we're talking about today. We're also aware as Jewish investors, in particular, of the rise in religious intolerance in America. According to the FBI, attacks motivated by bias or prejudice reached a 16-year high, and nearly 60% of hate crimes motivated by religion in the US targeted Jews and Jewish institutions. So this is a big issue. But it's also an issue that's bigger than just religious minorities. There's significant data on how creating a workplace that fosters religious coexistence is just better business. And there were a lot of great statistics and references in the earlier session on diversity, equity, and inclusion on how diverse workplaces are better for business. So a lot of that research applies also to religious diversity. And my colleague Rachel will share more about those later. And that's what we mean by religious coexistence. We're concerned about conflict, polarization, misunderstanding that can manifest in the workplace. It's not about more religion in the workplace, but we want to ensure that there's more space for diversity, for awareness, for going beyond merely what the law requires as avoiding discrimination to actually meet every employee's needs to allow employees to bring them full selves to work. It's just another axis for DEI work, in addition to the really vital and important work on racial diversity and on gender and a number of other axes of diversity, equity, inclusion work. So this is just another one of those important axes. I'd also like to note that others have been doing work and research in this area for a while, including the Tannenbaum Center for Interreligious Understanding. I believe Reverend Mark, the CEO of the Tannenbaum Center, will be joining us during this call, or maybe some of his colleagues. So thank you very much to the Tannenbaum Center for your input and collaboration and the work you do on interreligious understanding and coexistence. So I'd like to introduce my colleague, Rachel Cohen, who's JLEN's Director of Research, who will share more about our organization's experience advocating on this issue over the past year with corporations, what we've learned, dive deeper into the current state of corporate practices around religious accommodation and diversity. So Rachel, it's all yours.
Thank you, Rabbi Siegel. And thank you everyone for joining us, hanging in on Friday. I know we're all excited to go into the weekend with all this knowledge that we've been trying to absorb this week. It's been a compelling week, and many of you I've seen on other sessions, so I appreciate you and what you've shared as well. I'm really happy to share our advocacy efforts around religious coexistence. Rabbi Siegel really kind of set the stage for it, but what we have really been focusing our efforts on this past year, is engaging with companies and our portfolio on a broad range of issues, but really focusing on religious coexistence, collecting data and formulating some best practices. So it's been a journey with our direct dialogues. And I'd like to begin today with the business case, and then I'll discuss some of the specific asks around religious coexistence in our direct engagements, and that's also outlined in the investor statement as well. I believe you can click on that where you clicked on the Zoom.
I'll drop it in the chat too.
Great, thanks. And then I'll wrap up with some of the best corporate practices that we're seeing. So first, the business case to address religious coexistence is pretty compelling in the workplace. Religious coexistence, corporate best practices really involve promoting worker productivity by cultivating the best possible workplace environment for employees to thrive and bring themselves to work. And that's kind of the language that we've really been approaching with the companies. And as JLEN's investor statement notes, companies who have already adopted robust religious equity policies and practices generate greater worker productivity, and they increase talent retention as a result. For example, employees at companies that provide flexible hours for religious observance are more than twice as likely to look forward to coming to work. There's a lot of data and research behind some of the things that I'll mention, as well as workers whose companies offer educational programs about religious diversity and flexibility for religious practices report higher job satisfaction. And as we all know, as investors, it's clearly important for us to advocate for equity policies beyond just the lawful accommodation required under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And so this is really in the vein of what we're doing, focusing on religious coexistence. Now, second, it's very important to note that companies that fail to embrace religious coexistence are really increasingly exposing themselves and their investors, us, to a range of risks. The EEOC, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, reports that religious discrimination complaints rose by 67% between 2001 and 2014. And companies have really lost some high-profile legal cases on religious discrimination. So I'll mention several lawsuits also in the investor statement, but just to mention a few here. In 2015, I'm sure this will be familiar to many, the Supreme Court determined that Abercrombie and Fitch was wrong to refuse to hire a Muslim employee because she wore a hijab. 2018, EEOC sued Walmart for refusing a Seventh-day Adventist request to avoid working from sundown on Fridays to sundown on Saturdays for their Sabbath. And in 2019, a jury awarded an employee who worked as a dishwasher at the Conrad Hotel in Miami $21 million after she was forced to work on her religious holiday that she had requested off. And so clearly they're not just reputational risk, but there are some pretty intense liabilities for companies. And as we heard earlier in the workplace DEI, there's not enough data. They're not harmonizing. They're not doing enough. So these unfortunate cases really set the stage of the importance of religious coexistence practices and policies in the workplace. So I'd like to go next into what our specific asks are. What are the best practices that we've culled and that we are in dialogue with companies around religious coexistence? So the first part are the workplace policies. And those that we address are the dress and attire standards, religious holidays, food and meals, prayer, meditation space, and the establishment of faith-based employee resource groups or business resource groups, which you're all familiar with. And so I'll just go through them a little by little. First, the dress and attire standards. Really, we talk to companies, and this is more prevalent, about ensuring that dress for your day policies expressly communicate openness for employees to address consistently with their religious imperatives, including head coverings, facial hair, modest clothing. And we find this is accommodated in most cases, unless there's some kind of OSHA regulation, manufacturing companies where some of them will, for safety, have to wear kind of a mask, but over their beard. Or they can ask to move around the company. And so some of these hit some regulatory marks, but also knowing how transparent they are and understanding how they're communicating in a harmonized way across the company is really what we're trying to get to with the companies. Religious holidays. So this is an important one, maintaining transparency across the company regarding religious holiday leave, including clear managerial direction to ensure consistency across business lines. This is something that we came to after probably, a couple dozen companies we spoke to, but really noting that most companies thought they were following best practices by, making it a general policy to be flexible, but leaving it to the manager as a manager by manager approach to handle. And, kind of the feedback that we've been calling is that this strategy means that it's not handled in a harmonized way. It's not consistent. And so what we've been asking is that, instead of it requiring more effort and advocacy from employees, that it's top down, a transparent policy, and they have shared calendars and everyone knows that these are holidays that certain employees are absolutely going to take off across business lines. Best practices include 3 to 5 floating holidays annually they can use wherever they want. We've even seen, especially in the tech sector, unlimited time with manager approval. And so those are the kinds of things that we ask and encourage. In terms of the food and meals, companies should offer kosher, halal certified options at their cafeterias or at minimum vegetarian options to really address the religious dietary needs, and especially when they order food for events or meetings, that's accommodated. And with multinational companies, clearly they will implement these at their headquarters, but when we start asking across their entire operations, this becomes actually a way for them to foment an internal dialogue at their company. So we get a lot of I don't knows, and we're going to ask human resources, or in Malaysia or Indonesia, they kind of have their own way. But what we're asking is for them to cull the data in their company so that they do have these harmonized policies where this is really accommodated and that they know what is happening in their own company. Prayer meditation space, we ask that they dedicate space at company headquarters and across all facilities for employees who desire self-reflection, prayer, meditation during the workday. And we find most companies have some form of space. I think, you know, since I was in corporate America, you know, those were the days of looking for a space to pump for breast milk and so forth. And so that kind of set the precedent. And so what we hear from a lot of companies is, well, we have accommodations for those who want to pump breast milk. So some companies will double that, and or they'll say there are conference rooms, or they can go outside. We have beautiful grounds. And so, you know, we really say, well, thank you. Those are all nice things. However, we're asking for a dedicated space, because you don't need competition with women who are trying to pump their milk. You don't need competition for conference rooms that might be booked otherwise. And so really the best practices that we're seeing are those that have dedicated prayer space. And that's what we're really encouraging companies to augur internally, and not just at their headquarters, but across their operations and spaces. And the last component of the workplace policies and practices that directly really affect employees is the establishment of faith-based ERGs, BRGs, employee resource groups. And as we know, from everything that's been going on with racial injustice and companies starting to really jump on the defense and trying to also make statements, is that these ERG groups and BRG groups have been essential, and the companies have leaned on them to try to understand, people of color and that are their employees, from top executives to any employee, like, how do we address this and what would make it better for you? And the same goes for religious coexistence. So we really encourage the company to help facilitate faith-based ERGs, which can establish, mentoring programs, educational programs, really help with people understanding diversity at their company, and connect employees with role models as well. And then they can advocate from within much more for religious holidays and those kinds of accommodations we're talking about. Now, what we found is there are a handful of companies that do have faith-based ERGs, but the central issue is how they approach it. And so we see best practices as companies, encouraging the space and time for employees to spend with an ERG that can really help serve as a catalyst for employees feeling like the permission to join one. And others will say, well, of course, like anyone else, if an employee comes to us and says they want to start one, then we'll support that. So we'd like to see companies really having a hand in as a catalyst to help make space for a faith-based ERG. And lastly, on this point, we want to be careful to be clear that the goal is not to bring more religion into the workplace, but to ensure that those who have religious needs that relate to the workplace can advocate for themselves and find allies in each other. The last two parts here that are asks and that are in the investor statement are religious non-discrimination accountability, and then religious coexistence in the company's social footprint. So the non-discrimination accountability, really we ask companies to establish and publicize the steps that they'll take to respond to internal allegations of religious discrimination. I talked about the cases prior and the liability to companies, so we cite those. And how are they really integrating religious coexistence and anti-hate education within their unconscious bias training? And so this is really a point of dialogue with the companies. We'll spend 10 minutes talking about this. We all know what happened with Starbucks, and it upended their entire company to ask questions about what's going on in their culture, that there was just overt racism. And their entire organization rallied behind the need for anti-hate training being embedded in their unconscious bias training. And so we're asking companies to be proactive in this realm and not reactive. And what we're seeing is, yes, we did institute this just this year or just last year, and our C-suite is going through this training. So really advocating for this, the diffusion of this kind of training throughout, and what are they offering their employees, that it's comprehensive as well. And on the last point of religious coexistence and the company's social footprint, the two components there as relevant to the sector are the products and services, and then local communities. And so for many companies, really developing procedures to address potential religious intolerance or bigotry in their products and services is kind of the biggest point. For other companies, it's not as relevant, but in the tech sector or the online retail sector, this is a big issue. So if a corporation, for example, offers a product for sale that is bigoted or seemingly so toward religious minority, including hate imagery. So we've seen questionable items for sale on eBay or Amazon, which we have directly addressed. Social media platforms, how do they manage hate, conspiracy theories? I'll speak a little bit later. Twitter versus Facebook. This is very omnipresent in the news and what's just happening in our reality right now. So that's the scope of what's in the investor statement and covers the religious coexistence asks that we're conveying to companies. And so I'll end with what is the state of corporate progress on religious coexistence? Where have we come? Where are we going? And really, we find that the majority of companies are really beginning to think about this for the first time. Aligning and disclosing some data, some metrics, as Julie Tanner from CBIS mentioned, but we have so much farther to go. And we clearly are at a pivot point as many companies are diving in a renewed way in their DEI policies. At JLens, we've been working on this for over a year, but it seems like we're all coalescing around this point. So I'd like to share some additional insights from some of the companies that are clear leaders in this space. They're really just a handful at this point in our dialogue, but we are seeing best practices around Excel Energy, CVS Health, Accenture, and Cisco. Many have already developed well-developed workplace policies on dress for your day, transparent, clear calendars for holidays, religious holidays, and days off, where it's very clear across business lines, vertical and horizontal reporting lines, and Accenture and Cisco with their faith-based ERGs, as well as Excel. Intel received an award from the Religious Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Index. And so these companies have already been going through these thought processes. It isn't quite new. We're more helping them refine in a way as we raise these issues. And lastly, Twitter is an outstanding example of best practices in most areas that have to do with workplace policies and the ERGs, but it really an opportunity for us as investors to see what their approach on religious coexistence on their platform is. Robust faith-based ERGs, robust policies and practices with their employees, a very transparent culture. But when it comes to their products and services, around dangerous hate speech, they definitely have far exceeded where Facebook is at this point in time. I'm sure many of us are familiar, but there's still a lot of work to do, and including many instances of religiously targeted hate speech on their platform. And so you kind of see this give and pull with certain companies where they're excelling in one area, but still there's lots of room to grow in another, like any other point of advocacy, but this is really where our focal point is. And so I'll end there and happy to take questions at the end, but for now I'd like to segue back to Jacob to talk about the investor statement and ways you can sign up.
Great. So we'd like to end with this action step. We created an investor statement on religious coexistence that, this is really only is launching now. This is sort of our informal launch party, you could call it. We've been, reaching out with some targeted asks, but this is the first time we're bringing it to the ICCR community. We'll hope to include it in the newsletter in coming weeks. I just pasted it in the chat, and we would love for all of your organizations to consider signing on. I think it'll be really meaningful. We see this issue as well positioned. It's not an prohibitively expensive ask for a company. It's not an overwhelming. And as Rachel noted, companies have been starting to move, but it's been a process of education, bringing awareness to this as a topic, and companies saying, oh, we never thought about it. So the goal of this investor statement is really to say, actually, this is an important issue, and a whole range of investors care about it, a range of investors across different faiths. And in secular investors all care about this. We see the business case for this as a really important issue. So we'll pause there. We don't have a full hour worth of talking. We just wanted to introduce the topic, and if folks have questions or comments, we'd love to hear those, and we can keep it pretty informal. Everybody should be able to unmute yourself if you want to. So I'll pause there.
And we'd also welcome feedback from anyone's experiences, you know, as I went through some of the asks, if there are anyone that has any feedback or your experience with companies, we would value that as well.
Hi, this is Kate Monahan. I was just curious in terms of like if you've talked with companies that have a significant like retail presence. I guess I'm kind of thinking of like, you know, for spaces that are set aside, you know, for prayer meditation, that kind of thing. Like I feel like there would be more pushback from companies when you get to more of like a, you know, retail level or like a, you know, restaurant chain level. And I'm curious, you know, what your conversations like that have been like.
Sure, thanks, Kate. You know, I think it's clear that it depends on the culture of the company. You know, when they do have those brick and mortar facing areas that we have heard, well, there's a break space or there's a place that they can go and they'd have to coordinate with their employees. Clearly, it's more of like they could take a fresh breath of air and go outside. So I think there are more challenges, you know, in that sense. And so maybe the conversation there really needs to go to, you know, allotting time if there's not a space for it, for them to go somewhere where they're comfortable. And so I think that's a really good point. We've gotten to the point of collecting information, encouraging companies, especially in that retail space, like you mentioned, to ensure that there is space for them. But that just might not be possible when they're in these small storefronts in the retail sector. So it's a good point. And so perhaps the way to go there also is to ask about what kind of time that they can have if people need to step away for prayer meditation.
Awesome, thanks.
Mm-hmm. We're on this journey ourselves. I feel like we're definitely at a point where these best practices are very clear. However, it's a conversation and trying to understand what the realities are for different sectors and for the employees and where they are and the culture where they are. I believe that'll be kind of the next iteration, you know. So we've introduced this topic. Companies are hopefully adopting these best practices. We check in a year and it's like, okay, so what are you doing in Malaysia? And what are you doing for your, you know, Starbucks employees that are right next to each other and don't have a lot of place to go? And clearly we're in a COVID environment. And so there's that component as well. We're encouraged by what we're hearing. And I have to say, since we've launched this campaign, the receptivity is very high. And so we're still kind of working through scheduling a lot of follow-ups right now, and we're excited for the momentum. And like Rabbi Siegel said, we're very keen on hearing more from the investor community at ICCR too, and your feedback. Any other questions? Or should we wrap it up?
I actually have a quick question. And I think I heard you right. You said that a best practice as far as holidays or time off is floating holidays. I just wanted to clarify that. And so you feel like that's an acceptable solution to you know, make adequate accommodations for any and all religions?
Well, it's a very good question. I think part of it is, are those separate from the regular vacation time, sick time, and all of that, right? So in addition, and then what if there are more? What if, you know, you need to be gone for all of Ramadan, you know, or, and clearly the Jewish holidays are incessant in September. There's one tonight. Speaking of Coexistence for us, where Jacob and I are. So it's one of those, like, it's nuanced, right? So we kind of start the conversation with what do you already do? And then, so those are floating holidays, are those in addition? And so then we really encourage you, you know, since some of these holidays are extensive, how would you accommodate that? And that's when we a lot of times get well, with the manager position, you know, or the manager discretion. And that's where we say, you know, so that puts the onus on the employee to advocate for themselves. And what we are advocating for is that that doesn't have to happen anymore, that there are these policies that are harmonized, that it's clear, there's a calendar. And so for like Accenture and Cisco, they're like, oh, we have a calendar. Everybody knows when it's Ramadan. Everybody knows when it's the Eid, I'm probably saying that wrong. Everyone knows when it's Rosh Hashanah and all of these holidays. So these employees are going to take that off and that's it, you know, and whether it's using floating holidays or using other time that they need, it will be accommodated. And so it's a very good question. And so it's kind of that tricky conversation of finding where they are and then seeing where they need to go to really make it acceptable. So it's a transparent policy, and we're moving away from that employee-centered advocacy to it's an expected thing and normalized behavior in the company. Does that help?
Yeah, I love that. Yep, it does. Thank you.
Sure.
I have a question. In regard to that failure to embrace, are you experiencing any specific activity in regard to nonviolence? If you're taking the stand of nonviolence, are you do you have any wisdom to share with us in regard to keeping a nonviolent space?
So if I understand your question, you mean if there's a conflict between employees and there's a situation? It's a good question. I haven't had that conversation with a company. I think once we engage in the question of really ensure they go right to their EEO for ensuring that they're, you know, anti-discrimination policies and that they ensure that that's a, you know, something that happens. And so it's a great additive, I think, for what is their conflict resolution. You know, I assume that they would respond with human resources would handle that.
Oh, Rachel, you still there? No, we might have lost. Oh no. Okay. Well, that's all the answer you get. Here, Rachel's joining back in. But I'll just add one thing, Loretta, which is that it's a good question and tricky to navigate. You know, there's a lot of pieces to it. One is that we live in the United States in particular is a Christian-dominated country, certainly when it comes to holidays, when it comes to even just population. Another piece to navigate is that, you know, you might say, well, employees should leave those conversations at home, but research from the Tannenbaum Center says employees are already talking about religion at work. You know, 20+% of employees talk about their religion at least once a month at their workplace. So if those conversations are happening, it behooves us to make sure that they are respectful, that they're within the framework of embracing diversity. Those are some, I don't know if that gets to your question exactly about nonviolence, but maybe it sort of speaks to diversity.
I was wondering if you had any examples on that when she was giving the list of some things that didn't work. You know, like are the I can't think of any right now. I can't find my example right now. But you know, like if there are court cases or there are some legal things that that people find that it's been very disrespectful, or that it just didn't, they didn't feel like their needs were attended to.
And no, I think it's the point of the litigation, right? So
Yes,
I think, you know, and we find this all in all ESG areas is, oh, there's an anonymous reporting hotline, but people are fearful of using it for retaliation, right? And so I think it becomes, and that's why when, and I'll get back to your point, but with religious holidays, when they say it's really up to the manager, we want to avoid that one-on-one interaction and that being their only conduit of advocating for themselves, right? Because then they're kind of stuck, and then they don't want to upset their manager, and it could affect their review and their job. So elevating that conversation and saying, oh, we have a transparent calendar. Look, we're all allowed to take this holiday off. It's top-down policy. So thank you, I'm taking it off. That's really what we're looking for in regards to the conflict resolution piece. Like clearly all that litigation was between the manager and the employee, right? It didn't go farther, so they filed, you know, outside they filed against the company, and it didn't go higher than that. So, you know, I haven't had that conversation. I think it's a great query to say, has there been any conflict in the company? And do you collect data on that, and how do you resolve it? So I appreciate that feedback, because I think employees feeling like they have a safe space to resolve that conflict without their jobs being at risk is vital.
Can I also ask, do you talk about, and if you said this and I missed it because I'm zoomed out, forgive me, but do you ever incorporate like unconscious bias training or things like that in as well? Because I think, that's something I think we need to face in so many areas, but certainly also with regard to religion. So any thoughts there?
No, absolutely. And we've been asking the unconscious bias training for a while, just regard to DEI overall. And when we focus it on religious coexistence, we kind of include the anti-hate piece. And we kind of learned a lot from Starbucks. That was very helpful for us to understand their journey, and they disclosed to us a lot of what they went through, and how their top executives brought in other consultants, and for them to learn what the right kind of training is. And so that's really, I ask more questions about, well, what kind of unconscious bias training, and who do you bring in, and how often do you do it, and and does every employee have an opportunity? Is there an anti-hate component, and what is that? How do you help people uncover their own biases, right? Like, what's my conflict style? What's my bias? And so I think, these are the questions that we're asking, and we are getting information there. But I think in terms of like scoring the companies, it's really about, do you have an unconscious bias training? Are you incorporating anti-hate? Is it comprehensive and throughout the company? And that's where we are right now. And so kind of this baseline information we're collecting. And then as we grow, we're going to grow this. And then once we get farther with the companies, we can refine more, encourage more, advocate for more. And we're still asking internally, like, is there a shareholder proposal to be had from any of this? Is there something that we really want to key in that is really, that they're not mitigating overall? And what are we seeing? So we're seeing trends, we're seeing best practices, we're able to cull those and ask for what I outlined. But what all of you are raising are great nuanced ideas to really incorporate and push farther. So I appreciate that.
Just one thought to add to what Rachel said is, on the sort of, no company has so far said to us, we don't want to include, we don't want to do religious coexistence. It's more a process of education of like, well, this is, what do you currently have in place? And if you don't have things in place, how does that affect your employees? And so that a lot of that is the education piece, which is why the investor statement is a really great opportunity. It's a fantastic opportunity to sort of elevate this on the profile of companies as an issue that investors care about.
And what we're really seeing is, and as what you're seeing, every company is reviewing their DEI policies right now. And so this is actually a crucial time to say, don't forget about religious coexistence, that please, as they're putting energy towards this, they're actually very receptive and it's on their radar. So being comprehensive in equity and disclosures and including religion, not just in the EEO statements, but actually integrative to their practices, their policies, recognizing that employees are bringing themselves to work with their background as a full self. It's actually a really pivotal point to include religious coexistence that we're finding as well.
I have a question. This is Noam. So I know you work a lot on Israel, and a lot of the companies that you engage with have presence in Israel. And I'm looking at your statement. The last piece is helping companies prepare to respond when religious intolerance or bigotry occurs in the communities where they operate. And as we know, Israel has institutional religious intolerance towards Muslims and Palestinians and non-Jews in general. So do you engage with companies on that as well?
Thank you for bringing that up, Noam. This statement is really about a corporation's religious coexistence practices as it applies to their workforce, products and services. We as an organization believe, and it's a Jewish value for us, operation in Israel, operation on social and environmental axes in Israel, engaged in ESG work within Israel, operating along lines of peace, building coexistence. So those are all really important. But this ask is really focused on these broader questions of sort of religious coexistence. I don't know if that quite answers your question, but it's certainly, as an organization, we believe in investing in Israel, and it's an important pillar for us to see investing in Israel as a Jewish value and investing in improving the situation in Israel and using investment as a force for good.
Any other questions along those lines, or anything else?
Okay, great. Thank you all for your time. And we can end early. It's the last session of the conference. The conference can end a little bit early. So we hope that your institution will consider signing on to the investor statement. If you have more questions about it, please feel free to email us. We would love to be in touch. We'll miss seeing all of your faces after this week until the next time we gather. Okay. Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. Have a great weekend.
You too.
Thank you.